Acids and bases are a very common class of substances, and there are basically three definitions for what an acid or base is. So the most simple is the Arrhenius model, and in the Arrhenius model, acids are substances that produce hydrogen ions in aqueous solution, while bases are substances that produce hydroxide ions in aqueous solution. The more common definition that we use is the Bronsted-Lowry model. And in this model, acids are substances which donate protons, in other words an H plus ion, and bases are substances which accept these protons. So for example, when hydrochloric acid dissolves in water, it donates its proton to the water molecule. So here we have the water molecule, and then the HCl. So notice that one of these lone pairs on the oxygen atom can form a covalent bond with the proton from the HCl. So that's exactly what happens. The HCl donates this H plus proton to the water, and so the water, since it's a base, it accepts the proton and forms H3O plus, which is called hydronium. And then the chlorine is left by itself with a full octet. So we can generalize this reaction for any acid dissolving in water. So we have the acid HA. H represents the proton, while A represents anything else that the acid is made of. And then H2O, which acts as a base in this situation. And then they form the H3O plus, the hydronium, since the acid donates its proton to the water. And then that leaves the A minus, whatever is left of the acid after it donates its proton. And we call this A minus the conjugate base. It's what remains of the acid after it donates its proton. And it's a base because now that it lost an H plus, it's ready to accept one. And the conjugate acid is what's left of the base after it accepts the proton. And it's an acid because now that it has an extra proton, it's ready to donate it. And this dissociation reaction is an equilibrium. So it's basically the two bases, H2O and the conjugate base of the acid. These two bases are basically fighting over the proton, and the winner of that battle will decide the equilibrium position. So if H2O can attract the proton more than the A minus, then the equilibrium position will be further to the right, because the H2O attracts the H plus to form hydronium. If the conjugate base is a stronger base than H2O, meaning it can attract the H plus stronger, then the equilibrium will be further to the left, because the A minus attracts the proton to form the original acid, HA. So we can write the equilibrium expression for this dissociation reaction. And when we are dealing with the dissociation of an acid, we call the equilibrium constant Ka. That just means it's for an acid dissociation. It's not any different from the regular K. So the equilibrium expression, since we exclude water, since it's a pure liquid, is the concentration of hydronium and the concentration of the conjugate base on top, and then the concentration of the original acid on the bottom. And most times, instead of writing hydronium, we just write H plus, the proton. And this Ka is called the acid dissociation constant. So the strength of an acid, whether it's strong or weak, depends on this equilibrium position of the dissociation reaction. So again, it depends on the battle between the two bases, H2O and A minus, to see who will attract the proton more. So in a strong acid, the equilibrium is very far to the right. So the Ka value is very large, and the original acid basically completely dissociates into its ions. And since it's so far to the right, that means its conjugate base lost the battle with water for the proton. So strong acids produce very weak conjugate bases. And the most common strong acids are hydroiodic acid, hydrobromic acid, perchloric acid, hydrochloric acid, chloric acid, sulfuric acid, and nitric acid. Any acids other than these, you can pretty much assume that they're weak acids. So in a weak acid, the equilibrium is far to the left. So the Ka value is very small, and almost none of the original acid dissociates into its ions. So after reaching equilibrium, most of the original acid that you put there is still present. So that means the conjugate base won the battle over water for attracting the proton. So weak acids have relatively strong conjugate bases. The conjugate bases are much stronger than water. Now, note that this does not mean that their conjugate bases are classified as strong bases. And we'll talk more about bases later. So, when you see an acid, it's important to recognize that not all of the hydrogens are an acidic proton. Not all of them they can't donate all their hydrogens. So in most acids, the acidic proton is attached to an oxygen or a halogen, such as in hydrochloric acid. It's attached to the chlorine. So not all hydrogens in an acid are protons that they're going to donate. So for example, in sulfuric acid, here is the Lewis structure. You can see that the two hydrogens are attached to an oxygen. So sulfuric acid actually does have two acidic protons. It can donate two protons. And we'll talk more about acids with more than one proton later. Whereas acetic acid, only one of the hydrogens is bonded to an oxygen. The other three are attached to this carbon. So acetic acid actually only has one acidic proton. It can only donate one proton. It won't donate these three hydrogens. So an amphoteric substance is something that can behave either as an acid or a base depending on the situation. And the most common example of this is water. And you can see this with what's called the autoionization of water. Basically, water undergoes an acid-base reaction with itself. It transfers a proton from one molecule, which acts as the acid, to another water molecule, which accepts the proton and acts as a base. So it forms hydronium and hydroxide. And if we write the equilibrium expression for this autoionization of water, it'll be the concentration of H+, because we write H+ instead of hydronium most of the time, times the concentration of hydroxide. Since on the left, it was both pure liquids, so we don't include them in the equilibrium expression. So at 25 degrees Celsius, the equilibrium constant for this reaction, which is called Kw, is always 1 times 10 to the negative 14th. So if we have water at 25 degrees Celsius, you know that the concentrations of H+ and hydroxide will always multiply to this number. So if you have one of the concentrations, you can use this to find the other, and vice versa. So if we have neutral water, it's not acidic or basic, then the concentrations of H plus on hydroxide will be equal at 1 times 10 to the negative 7th. And so we can measure the acidity or basic of a substance with the pH scale. And it's the scale that goes from 0 to 14, with 0 being the most acidic and 14 being the most basic. So we calculate pH by taking the negative log of the concentration of H+. And there's also another scale called pOH, which is found by taking the negative log of the concentration of OH. And so if you have one or the other, if you have one, you can find the other, because pH plus pOH will always add up to 14. And for doing significant figures for pH numbers, you take the number of decimal places. So if we have pH of 9.00, that counts as 2 sig figs, not 3. So now we're going to start looking at solving acid-base problems. The most common type of problem is finding the pH of a solution of some acid. So the first thing you want to do in these problems is write out the major species, which are the chemicals present in relatively large amounts. And then once you have those major species, you can decide which of them will have the greatest effect on the pH. So if we have a solution of 0.1 molar nitric acid is a strong acid, so it almost completely dissociates into its ions, H plus and NO3 minus, when put in water. So the major species will be H plus, NO3 minus, and H2O, since we are in water. So now we have to decide which of these major species will have the greatest contribution to the pH. So the ones that we want to look at are the H plus from nitric acid and the water, since remember water undergoes autoionization to produce a small amount of H plus. However, if we look at the equilibrium for the dissociation of water, the extra H plus from the nitric acid, by Le Chatelier's principle, will shift this equilibrium to the left. So water will produce less hydroxide and less H plus due to the extra H plus given off by nitric acid. So we can assume that the nitric acid is the only main contributor to the pH. So the concentration of H plus in the solution is just 0.1 molar, because it all comes from the nitric acid basically. So to find the pH, we just take the negative log of the concentration of H plus in solution. So negative log 0.1 is equal to 1. So this solution is very acidic, which we expect because it's a strong acid. So next we have a solution of 1 times 10 to the negative 10th molar hydrochloric acid. Now, hydrochloric acid is a strong acid, so it dissociates completely. However, if you look at the concentration, it's so small that it's actually not a major species. So in this solution, water is the only major species. And this makes sense if we look at the contribution of H plus from both hydrochloric acid and water. The hydrochloric acid, since it dissociates completely, will donate 1 times 10 to the negative 10th molar H plus. And remember, in water, in neutral water, there are 1 times 10 to the negative 7th H plus. So there's actually a lot more H plus donated by water than from the HCl. So water is the only main contributor to the pH, which means the pH of the entire solution is just the pH of neutral water, which is 7.